Uh, Tim Cole is a professor of social history and the director of the Brigstow Institute at the University of Bristol. He is a pioneer in digital humanities, especially as it relates to the Holocaust. He's been working in this field for over a decade. Actually working in the field, I think, almost before the terminology of digital humanities was coined. So I'm going to turn the session over to Tim, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the session for questions. Thank you, Tim.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Armin, for the kind invitation. It's one of those rare days today where it's the same temperature in Bristol, England as it is in Barcelona in Spain. So I'm in there in spirit, if not in reality. What I wanted to do just for the next 30 to 40 minutes is to share a little bit of some of the reflections of working for about a decade, as Armin said, with digital humanities tools within genocide studies. And in particular, to talk about the work of a collaborative that I'm part of, Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. So in a sense, they're personal reflections, but they're very much personal reflections on what has been a collaborative project. And I suppose that's one of the things that's distinctive about digital humanities ways of working, is that within the humanities, I think they bring much more the kind of lab model of collaborative working compared to the sort of more usual models of soul scholarship that I guess most of us were trained in during our PhD research. And so this has been a project that has involved many others. It's a team that has kind of grown and shrunk at different times according to what we've been working on. Has brought together historians like myself, geographers, GI scientists, cartographers, computer scientists, natural language processors. So a really broad range of different disciplinary perspectives. And I think it's one thing that really interests me about digital humanities projects, and it's actually what I do in the Brigstow Institute at the university, is really think hard about how do we kind of foster those sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary ways of working, and what are some of the soft skills that are needed for that, as well as the kind of hard skills, if you like, in that way. One thing I've always been struck by is this quote from Elie Wiesel. He's perhaps the most famous of Holocaust survivors because of the book that he writes, Night. And what really strikes me is his way, in a sense, that he talks about genocide as an experience of a shrinking universe. So he uses profoundly spatial language to describe what the experience of genocide is like. And I guess that underpins the work of our collaborative, is very much a sense that genocide happens not just in time, but also in space. And I think two key ideas have been really central to underlie the work. And in some ways, I kind of start with them because I think they make sense then, if you like, of the kind of sets of methods that we've adopted. So I guess one thing that's crucial within the digital humanities is a careful matching of tools and methods with the sort of research questions that are being asked. That there's a whole sort of set of toolkits out there, and I'll demonstrate a number of different toolkits we've used. But I think crucially, they have to match up with the nature of the questions that are being asked, if you like, the kind of almost underlying epistemological assumptions and ideas and arguments, as well as the nature of the data, which I'll say a lot more about in a moment. But I think two things have been really critical in the work that we've done. It's first of all to think very much about genocide as a spatial process. So in a sense, I think our starting assumption has always been that genocide is a spatio-temporal process. And that means that it doesn't just happen in particular places. It doesn't just happen on, if you like, little particular points of the Earth's surface, but it actually happens with and through space and place. That space and place are critical in enabling and hindering genocide in really important ways. And so that assumption, I think, that kind of way of thinking has been critical to a lot of the use of digital mapping, which I'll show you in a moment. I think the second thing that we've always been really conscious of, and is almost like a kind of underlying principle, is that genocide is always a multi-scalar event. So as well as a spatial process, genocide always happens at one and the same time at multiple scales. And I think that can be illustrated in the case of someone like Elie Wiesel. So the late Elie Wiesel and his own experience of genocide during the Holocaust of European Jews can be understood, I think, at the scale of the continent. In particular, I think his experience is about a continental movement of slave labor through Auschwitz as a node within a network of slave labor camps. But it's also a story about national conflict and cooperation between the Hungarian and German state in 1944. It's also a story which is about a particular region, which is critically, I think, a multi-ethnic borderland region on the cusp of Hungary and Romania, this kind of area of Transylvania, that's this contested territory throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It's also very much a local story of a very particular community, Siget, one town within that region, within that national context, within that continental context. And like all genocide, it's about gendered bodies. It's about the gendered body of a young teenage boy who's caught up within the genocidal industrial military complex. And I think that sense of genocide happening not just through spatial process or through spaces and places with place, but also happening at multiple scales is really critical to think about. And that's, again, a kind of starting assumption, I think, a kind of starting point for the mapping work that we've been trying to do, which is to try and bring scale and multi-scalar analysis as well as spatial analysis to the fore within the study of genocide. And so what I want to do is I want to give just 3 examples of some of the work that we've been doing to think a little bit about how a variety of ways of digital mapping may be helpful in uncovering what I'm terming spatiotemporal patterns within genocide. But to think about that at a number of different scales, as well as to think about the way that the scale of genocide, a genocide like the Holocaust, in some ways I think also demands these kinds of ways of working to start to visualize and to lay bare, uncover critical spatial patterns. So first up, I wanted to start at a national scale. So to think of the work of a couple of my colleagues, Alberto Giordano and Anna Hollian. They're both based in the US. Alberto's a GI scientist, Anna is a historian. And the focus of their work has been in particular on thinking about the arrest and deportation of Italian Jews during the Holocaust, and to think most critically about spatiotemporal patterns. What I show you first is a screenshot from an animation that's available on the Stanford Spatial History Lab website. So we've worked a lot with Stanford, and in particular Eric Steiner, at Stanford, who's a key player in the Spatial History Lab there. And animated mapping has become a really important tool for us as part of a kind of research process, because it enables an opportunity to think spatially and temporally at the same time. I think one of the challenges of much digital mapping, in particular using ArcGIS, which is the main software that we've used, although not the only one, is that digital maps tend to be fixed in time. That in a sense they foreground spatial patterns, and so in some ways kind of lessen or damp down temporal patterns. And one thing we've been really interested in doing is thinking about how can we think about the way that spatiotemporal patterns emerge across both time and space. And so digital mapping has been a really critical way of thinking about this. What I show you here is just one interface and one set of variables that are mapped out. And in particular, what this map tries to do is it tries to think about how far were those Jews in Italy arrested? How far were they from home? Were they arrested at home, which is the lighter colors? So you'll see some of those up here in the north of the country, as well as down here in Rome or in Florence and Bologna, in Milan, in Turin. How far were they arrested close to home? How far were they arrested a long way from home? Here, crucially, on the Italian-French border, and as well down here in the south of the country. And it's really to try and think a little bit about movement of Jews within Italy as they attempted to escape from the persecution, and to think a bit about how the movement of Jews interacted with arrest. But what I want to focus on much more is this set of maps, which I think were really critical maps in thinking differently about the Holocaust in Italy. And here I want to stress, and I think this is a kind of critical idea that's laid at the heart of all of our work, is to think very much of digital mapping as a part of a research process. So as a way of trying to make sense of the data. This data is a vast database created of all of the Jews arrested and deported from Italy during the course of the war. And in a sense, it's one of those kind of masses of data that are really hard to get within, not using digital methods, using kind of analog methods. It's hard to read. It's hard to identify spatial patterns or temporal patterns. And I think this series of maps was one of the really significant sets of maps generated through this project. In a sense, what the team did was ran a series of maps through a number of variables. Where were men and women arrested and deported from? Where were young Jews and older Jews arrested and deported from? You know, a whole series of variables. What was most striking was this map of where were Jews arrested by Germans and where were Jews arrested by Italians. And what you start to see is you see two very different spatial patterns emerging. That German arrests tended to be focused on large cities, places like Rome, and tended to be focused on single events. Whereas the pattern of arrest by Italians was much more dispersed, was much smaller numbers of Jews scattered across the country. And another way of visualizing that is to visualize that in a much more temporal way. So this is a timeline running from 1943 to 1945. Germans as arresters are in red here, Italians as arresters in blue. And what you see is this initial burst of arrests of large numbers of Jews by Germans, and then gradually tailing off the German involvement and much more a foregrounding of Italian involvement in arrest and deportation, and smaller numbers, much more dispersed smaller numbers. So taken together, this kind of spatial pattern of very different arrests and a temporal pattern of very different arrests, I think really led to an uncovering of a very distinctive and critical role played by Italian perpetrators in almost the kind of mopping up of a kind of later stage, the secondary stage of genocide, where crucially local knowledge was utilized to identify small numbers of Jews, either moving away from the country in hiding or in some cases arrested at home. In some ways, these visualizations are ones that can be published, but they were most critically, I think, less an output, a kind of research output, and much more critically, a research tool to get to this, which is a honing in on asking the question of why do very different spatiotemporal patterns emerge amongst German and Italian arrests, and what does this suggest about the critical interaction and role between German and Italian perpetrators in the prosecution of genocide within Italy. And I think that same idea of digital mapping as a kind of process tool, of visualization as a way of trying to find out what the smart questions are to ask, of taking a mass of data and trying to imagine it and render it, explore it in different ways, is something that you can really see in the second project, which was led by an architectural historian at Duke, Paul Jascott, and a historical geographer in Maine, and Kelly Knowles. What really struck me about this project was it was a project which, in a sense, took a single archive and tried to visualize it. So it worked with a very discrete and vast archival collection. In this case, the extant building archives from Auschwitz. Auschwitz is one of the very unusual camps where we have all of the architectural drawings survive in the post-Holocaust period. So there's a kind of very rich archival collection. And in a sense, the team thought, well, what do you do with an incredibly rich archive? How do you try and visualize an archive? And what does visualizing the archive suggest about the kinds of research questions or the kinds of analysis that needs to be undertaken? Again, one way to do this is temporally. So to think about temporal patterns. So what you have here is you have a timeline running from 41 to 44 down the bottom. which is really literally about just building. What are the bursts of building activity within Auschwitz-Birkenau? And what you see is you see two bursts of activity, one in 1943, in the spring of 1943, and then a second one in the early part of 1944. It's very suggestive, I think, of priorities, priorities of construction within Auschwitz, and interestingly, a kind of a drop-off in the middle period, in the later part of 1943, which again is very suggestive around shifting Nazi policy. But also what the team wanted to do was to try and map this out on the ground. Here, not using GIS because they're working at the scale of an individual camp, but much more working with the plan. And what you see shaded is you see shaded construction. So if you know Auschwitz, on the bottom right, you have the main entrance and gateway into Auschwitz with the rail train tracks that run up to the two main crematoria, the women's camp off to the left, the men's camp and family camp off to the right. New camp that's planned to be built over here on the far right-hand side, and the so-called Canada section where goods are sorted up here on the center left, and then two large crematoria built here, 3 and 4, just near to that part of the camp. And what the team did was really to shade in, if you like, the act of construction at Auschwitz across 1943 and into 1944. And then to render that as a 3D view shed, so to visualize the camp during this critical period of 43 and 44, when most of the inmates are taken to this camp. Jews like Elie Wiesel end up there, so taken from Seagate by train up to Auschwitz-Birkenau in the spring of 1944. This is the camp that Wiesel enters into, with shaded in red buildings that are under construction and are recently constructed. And what I think was really interesting about this project was that it really caused a reimagining of Auschwitz-Birkenau as a construction site, that it drew to the fore that genocide both took place and was evaded within essentially what was a ongoing construction site. Auschwitz was never finished. It was never a complete project. It was always a place in process. It was always being constructed with two bursts of major construction. And I think what was really striking in this project was, by reimagining Auschwitz, if you like, taking the archive, the building archive, visualizing it, beginning to see the centrality of construction and building within the Auschwitz experience, within the nature of this place. Taking that, exploring, understanding, imagining, seeing that, then started a kind of asking of new questions and a spotting of new areas of importance and significance. And in particular, what's really striking, I think, in the case of Auschwitz-Birkenau, is that the major periods of escape within this camp coincided with the major periods of building. That Auschwitz was a place that was incredibly difficult for prisoners to escape from, but the points at which prisoners did escape was at these two peaks of building. A kind of alliance, if you like, between a construction site and a place where borders became much more porous during the context of the Holocaust. Maybe a final example of spatiotemporal patterns comes from my own work with Alberto Giordano. I'm trained as a historical geographer, but also a social historian. Alberto's, as I've said, a GI scientist. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to shift scales to think about a city and to think a bit about one city and about the movement of Jews within a city, both through a series of ghettos in the context of the war, but also in the aftermath of the war, to try and think a bit about how survivors rebuild lives post-genocide and the streets of a city. It's a city that had a very unusual form of ghetto. I guess if you think of somewhere like Warsaw, the ghetto in Warsaw was a much kind of more clearly bounded, walled-in space. Within Budapest, the decision is made to place Jews into houses distributed all the way across the city. So around 2,000 houses end up being used, large apartment buildings in the city where Jews are housed. One of the things that digital mapping allows us to do is it allows us to start layering the map and to start inserting additional information into the map. And I think this is really critical because one of the things that geographers emphasize is an idea, this really comes from the work of Agnew, where he talks about the critical difference between location and locale. Location is the dot on the map. It's the map that I'm showing you now. So that in a sense, every place within the world has a longitude or latitude that you can attach to it, and you can mark it as a dot on the map. But as we know, places are much more than just dots on the map. They have a material presence to them, and they also have a kind of socio-political, cultural context to them. The world is made up of more than dots on the map. And one of the things we were able to do was to start to bring census data into our dots on the map, if you like, to kind of layer up dots on the map with census data, to start to visualize a city which was made up of larger and smaller buildings. As any of you who know Central European cities know, not all dots on the map are equal. Not all street addresses and numbers are the same size. Some are very large apartment buildings and some are much more smaller family homes. And you really see that from a capsule here of focusing in on the left on the central districts of Budapest, of Pest, where you've got very large apartment buildings, and then moving out towards the top of the section here to these family homes, to these kind of suburban family homes, which are much smaller. And this became really important for us. This sense of bringing a number of map layers together became really important for us as we tried to understand the different forms of ghettoization that were implemented in the city. One thing that really struck us was as we started to layer a number of different maps of a variety of ghettos. From the left, the ghetto plans in early May 1944, through in the center, the different forms of dispersed ghettoization adopted in June 1944, to on the right, much more core centralized ghettoization adopted in the winter of 1944. What was really striking was the sense that, in a sense, the ghetto hardly shifted. That once we started to inflect these ghetto addresses through census data, what we found was an incredible commonality, a kind of center of gravity, if you like, to ghettoization. And that really caused us to rethink ghettoization, the story of ghettoization as this city, as not one of change, with, if you like, bringing Jews to multiple ghettos, but much more one of continuity, of, in a sense, bringing the ghetto to Jews, and a story of ghettoization that much more reflected Jewish demographics within the city. One of the other things that GIS mapping allowed us to do was to introduce another layer to this map, which was to introduce the street network in 1944, Budapest, to the map, and then to start mapping out where Jews could go within the city by walking, as we know most Jews did during the brief curfew time that was a period when they could leave their homes, their ghetto homes. And what was really striking for us here was to run through, if you like, a series of crucial places, sites that Jews needed to get to, in this case, Jewish designated hospitals. There's a series of 4 hospitals that were places where Jews were allowed to receive medical treatment during this period. They're really critical places to go to visit sick relatives, as well as to access health care during this period of the Holocaust, the ghettoization period. And what became striking for us was how accessible or inaccessible these sites became to Jews living in different parts of the city. We mapped out 30-minute walking times to those hospitals. We mapped out 1-hour walking times. We mapped out what lays beyond the dark grey, which was much further than 1 hour, in a sense, places that were inaccessible because of the nature of the curfew in this city. And that got us thinking a bit about Jews living within these peripheral sites within the city, to start mapping out the ghetto houses that were furthest from critical resources like hospitals, like market halls for shopping, as well as from the rest of the Jewish community. And it got us thinking a bit about how we reimagine ghettoization, not just as a separation of Jews from non-Jews within this city, but also the separation of Jews from other Jews, as well as from critical resources. So the visualization, if you like, helped us to start to imagine what we began to term almost like invisible walls that existed within a city, as we started to think about distance and proximity, and started to think about placemaking activities like walking and how that plays out within experiences of ghettoization. More recently, one of the things we've done is we've started to map out this really unique source, which is a register of Jewish survivors in Budapest, created by American Jewish Committee and others, World Jewish Congress. And it's really designed as a tool for family members to find out the fate of those caught up in the Holocaust. And so it's a listing of names. One thing that it allows us to do on the right is to map out where Jews are living in the city in 1945. As Jews return to the city or leave the ghettos, come back from camps and labor camps, and re-inhabit this city, we were able to start mapping that out against the ghetto period. But I think what's been particularly interesting for us is to be able to sort of start delving inside some of those doors. And I think this is one of the things where I'd kind of shift tempo in some ways, which is to start introducing another series of visualizations, which almost point to the limits of using a software like ArcGIS. In the sense, ArcGIS is a kind of software that enables us to operate almost at a kind of bird's eye view of a city, and to think a bit about spatial patterns or spatiotemporal patterns in a city. Here you see a spatiotemporal pattern of a shift from Jewish occupation within 1944 into Jewish occupation in 1945. But actually what's critical, I think, for us as scholars is really to enter into those buildings, to get inside those buildings, to get inside those dots on the map, and start to try and understand the nature of spatial relationships within those buildings. So one of the things we've started to do, and this is just an example of one street and one house, which we can do in an automated process, is to start to visualize who's living inside these buildings in 1945. What's the nature of the survivor community in this post-genocidal city? And in particular, what new kinship groups are formed not just in space, but crucially also through space. And what you find here is you find, I think, some really striking new sort of kinship groupings formed. Down at the bottom left, you've got a more kind of classic nuclear family of father and mother and 3 daughters. But what you have in most places is singles, in this case, a single man on the far right. And the top left, you've got a sibling group. I think a really classic post-genocidal new sort of family structure of a very narrow age demographic here of 2 brothers and 1 sister who survive and form a new sibling community within this house. And here a very interesting, complex new group, this kind of multi-kinship level group that's formed within this one house. The house becomes a place for a new kinship group to form, which is not a nuclear family, but something far more dispersed, which in particular in this context recognizes the death of men serving in the labor battalions in Hungary. And so these new kind of more all-female kinship groups are created within the spaces of the city. And I think that points to one of the things that we've really encountered as a team, is that as useful as a range of digital humanities softwares have been for uncovering spatiotemporal patterns of genocide at a variety of scales, we've realized the limitations of that and the need, if you like, to get in science, rendering on more than that, because of the ability of layering and also of adding in locale and not just location. But one of the things I think we've been really conscious of is that there's a terrible danger in adopting digital humanities methods, and in particular ArcGIS, of replicating the perpetrator archive and the perpetrator gaze. So in a sense, ArcGIS has been incredibly useful when working with an archive like the Auschwitz building archive, or a set of digital humanities tools have been really useful for that. But there's been a sense, I think, in which we've really realized the limits of those, in particular as we've started to turn away from perpetrator sources to much more think about victim sources. And maybe I could just finish by giving a few examples of that, which in a sense have forced us, I think, to adopt a whole new set of methods, of digital humanities methods, and also to critique, in a sense, some of the methods that we've used ourselves, and in particular to critique ArcGIS, which demands a kind of a certainty of longitude and latitude that isn't always necessarily there within victim sources. Let me just give you one example of that from Alberto, my own work. One of the things that we've done is, as I've suggested, is we've been really interested in trying to think a bit about proximity and distance, about movement through a city, when a city is exposed to ghettoization during the Holocaust. And what we map out here is we map out the presence of the Swedish legation buildings in Budapest. If any of you know anything about wartime Budapest, you may well have heard of the name of Raoul Wallenberg, Swedish diplomat sent under the auspices of World Jewish Congress to Budapest, and is involved in giving out passports, kind of temporary passports, to Jews who receive some sort of protection. It's part of broader protection offered to Jews by the neutral legations. And so in the autumn of 1944, one of the crucial places for Jews to get to was to legation buildings like these ones. And so what we did here was we mapped out 30-minute, 60-minute, and more than 60-minute walking times to those two buildings, just to think a little bit about, well, who could get there easily, who couldn't get there easily, to start to think about invisible walls. In particular, we're interested in this community, a sort of traditional Orthodox community in Óbuda, and their absence of access to this, the sort of distance between them and these buildings, which starts to emerge in some survivor narratives. But one of the things that was really interesting when we started to think a bit about the importance of distance, about invisible walls, was that it took us back to the archive. And this, I think, is a critical aspect of digital humanities work, that for me, a map like this is never the finished product. This is process. This is part of a research process. It's incorporating this into the process in the way that we incorporate more traditional close reading techniques, or much more the kind of interpretive methods that are kind of common to the ways that we operate as scholars. The crucial thing about process is it takes us back to the archive with new questions. And in the sense, this took us back to the archive to ask a question about how important was distance? How important were these invisible walls that we were starting to map out in the city? And here's an example of where we found a survivor who talks about the ways that these invisible walls were got around, most crucially by calling into play non-Jewish inhabitants within ghetto buildings. And it really suddenly started to draw attention to the fact that within the Budapest ghetto, that the nature of dispersed ghettoization was that non-Jews were permitted to live within ghetto buildings, and they suddenly became a critical asset. And this, in a sense, took us down a whole new avenue of research, which was suggested, I think, by the fact that we became interested in distance, and then returned to the archive a whole new set of questions that meant that we actually realized the questions we started with weren't the most important questions, that the digital humanities work was a crucial part of process. But it also started to undermine the models that we created and point to the ways in which victim voices, in a sense, disrupted the kind of models we were adopting. And I think that's really important in the work of Scholl Friedlander. This is some of his very early work, where he starts to talk about the ideas of an integrated history, and I'd say an integrated geography of Holocaust. I'd say also we could expand this to genocide. How do we create integrated histories and geographies of genocide that allow for this kind of puncturing of victim voices alongside the kind of more dominant voices of the paperwork of the genocidal state? And that's what I want to finish with some reflections on. This really came to the fore in some work that was led by Simone Gigliotti, who's now in London, Eric Steiner at the Spatial History Lab, and Mark Mazurowski, an independent scholar. One of the things that this team wanted to do was they wanted to try and map out the evacuations from Auschwitz in January 1945. So one of the things that happens in Auschwitz, a place where Elie Wiesel ends up, is that in 1945, just in the advance of the Soviets coming in from the east, the camp, in a sense, is basically placed on the road, and the camp is kind of marched, prisoners and guards, westwards to entrainment points, and then taken on to slave labor camps further in the west in the Reich. And one of the things that they started to do was they started to map out the routes that the camps took as they took to the roads in 1945. The paperwork is very limited. This is a much more kind of chaotic process, and so there's a lack of paperwork. And they also felt that in some ways mapping out the routes taken was not necessarily the most interesting intellectual question. And this, as Anne Knowles reflected in a later piece, was a kind of crucial turning point for us. And in particular, it was a sense of reflection that there was a need for tools other than GIS, for different kinds of digital mapping that were much more humanistic, and that might unearth different kinds of research questions to the ones that we began with. If you like, as a project team, I think we very much began using a set of tools, ArcGIS, and then in some ways we came to a point in this project of really thinking about the limits of those tools and the need to generate new tools, which I've already shown in the case of Alberto and my work on post-genocidal family patterns. Just finished with this as an example. What I think was really interesting is as this team started working, they realized that the German archive offered very little, and they started to look much more at testimony, post-war testimony. In this case, created in a legal context, primarily with Polish women. What they started to do is work with a series of post-war testimonies given in a legal context by prisoners, women prisoners who were marched from the camps. And they became interested in literally mapping out that testimony along the route of this march, this death march. So starting at the top, on the top right, the camp and the departure point, the 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers along the route, here at 50 kilometers, here at 60 kilometers at the end point, as well as testimony that happened somewhere along the route. And then what they did was they started to do this with a number of different testimonies. So in a sense, to start working through testimony after testimony to start mapping this out along the route of this particular march. And then to aggregate that testimony, as you can see, by reducing it by single words and single letters, and to start mapping out testimony along the route of this evacuation. So from the departure point to the end point during the march. And what became particularly interesting were the presences and absences, that the women don't remember all of this march, but they remember particular moments along the way. And that this is aggregated out, that there's particular moments that all of them remember within their testimony, and some moments that few of them remember within their testimony. And that particular people are remembered at particular places along that route, that the SS officers are critical at the end, at a particular moment, as are these two individuals, that we is something that persists more, that the capos kind of come and disappear, the SS remain as a much more kind of constant presence. And in a sense, what it caused them to do was to start thinking a bit about how do you map out narratives? How do you use a new set of DH tools to visualize narratives? And that's something that we've really started to do. We've worked a lot with corpus linguistics and to think a bit about how we might map out about testimony. Just finished with this, which is the work of Hannah Polingoli, and I think it's really interesting and important work because one of the things that she does, I think, is in a sense take this idea of Saul Friedlander about bringing almost perpetrator, the kind of certainty of perpetrator sources and the fragmentary nature of many victim sources directly into conversation with each other, and to bring a series of different DH tools, digital humanity tools, into conversation with each other. She talks in particular about the Visual History Archive of the Shoah Foundation, which many of us, I'm sure, are aware of, which collects together testimony not just from the Holocaust, but from other genocides. And she's in particular been interested in the kind of disjuncture between the kind of certainty of the Google map that maps out everywhere that a survivor went through on their trajectory of genocide, alongside the moments of uncertainty, what she calls the black holes. And I think this is something that any of us who've worked with survivor narratives will be aware of, that there's moments where a survivor doesn't know where they are in the nature of genocide that often is about profound dislocation across landscapes, often at vast scale. Obviously, there's moments where genocides are incredibly intimate, where murder and hiding happen very close to home. But there's also moments where mass population transfers take place. And in the midst of that, there's often a kind of disorientation, which she suggests lies actually at the heart of persecution and the genocidal experience. And I think her words are ones that we really resonate with our sense of holding together a kind of tension of the value of using the kind of certainty demanded by GIS mapping and other tools to try and uncover spatiotemporal patterns within genocide, with, if you like, a kind of more humanistic impulse to disrupt that map and to hold the two in tension. That in some ways, genocide is something that can be mapped, but is also unmappable. And for me, I think one of the challenges of the work is to bring that all together, if you like, a kind of humanistic impulse driven by engaging with victim voices alongside the kind of much more state genocidal state process stuff that we find within the archives, to bring those together and to think a bit about not just single mapping of genocide, but multiple mappings and multiple mapping tools that allow us to uncover spatiotemporal patterns of genocidal states, but also to alert ourselves to those moments of disorientation and dislocation that lie also at the heart of the spatial experience of genocide. But let me stop there and open up for questions.
Thank you, Tim, for a very fascinating presentation. What I'm going to do, I know that we have some questions that have come in the chat, and because the fact that we are on Zoom, and it would take time for me just to repeat every question, I'm going to ask people to raise their hands using the reaction button on Zoom, and I will try to call on you. I know Henry Terrio put a question in the chat, so I'm going to begin with Henry. Are you there? And can you summarize your question?
Sure. Yeah, it's probably ill-formed, Armin. But you started to address it actually in the talk after I posted it. But I'm very interested in this relationship between narrative time and objective time and location and locale, which I think, parallel in really interesting ways. And the way you were talking about the role of space and place in understanding narratives of survivors and so forth, I think is really interesting. So I'm wondering if you can comment on these sort of complicated issues that evolve. And then maybe a simpler one is just, oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna pop up here. Just a simpler way to think about that is just when you're discussing the importance of distance, it is true that's a spatial relationship, but it matters because of the time to travel as well as the proximity for perception, right? So if you're beyond earshot or eyesight, that's a particular relationship, but also movement is part of that. So I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on that as well, because I found it fascinating what you've presented in this way.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Henry, the great questions. And I mean, I think I feel almost slightly embarrassed because I'd been working, I'd worked previously on Budapest, and I'd been working, from a kind of broadly geographical perspective, but I hadn't really ever thought about distance. And I think especially my sense is that I think a lot of the nascent work on geographies of genocide has tended to focus on fixed sites rather than necessarily to think primarily in spatiotemporal terms about movement. And actually, one of the things that mapping out the street network did was that it introduced, if you like, a kind of concept to me, which I feel like I should have thought more about, but I hadn't. In some ways, I think one of the things, I guess, in scholarship is that we don't know what we don't know. Like, we sometimes just don't know what the smart questions to ask. There's questions that we've never even imagined asking. I guess all of us have that experience, don't we, in the archive, where finding something in the archive forces us, it kind of prompts a new question in our mind. And I think for me, one of the things that's been really valuable about digital mapping is that it's really brought my attention, alerted my attention to the importance of proximity and distance more generally within genocide studies. That I feel like that should be something that's much more to the fore in a lot of the work that we do, for the very reasons that you talk about, that it's critical in ideas like knowledge. How far is there proximity to the killing that can both benefit and hinder? In some ways, you don't want to be too close, do you? But you also don't want to be so far away that you don't know what's happening. How quickly are you alerted? And one of the things that we've started to do a lot in the work that we've done, Alberto and I, in a piece, the most recent piece we published in Journal of Historical Geography, is to try and think about distance and proximity as both a topographical and a topological concept. So that distance and proximity has, if you like, a kind of Cartesian dimension to it, that kilometers and miles are really critical. How close and how far are you from others and from events and from knowledge and from help and from harm? So there's a kind of sense in which I think we need to pay attention to distance and proximity within genocide studies as having a kind of a physical miles or kilometers dimension to it. But it's also something that's topological, which is about social networks and relationships, because we know that knowledge doesn't just transfer in a kind of even way across kilometers and miles, but it comes through people, and it comes through contacts. And actually, it's also about how topologically close are you, how relationally close are you to events or knowledge. How quickly are you alerted to things through a set of networks? And so we've become really interested in thinking about distance as a topological and topographical concept. And obviously the way you map that out differs, because I think there's a kind of GIS, in a sense, is a way of thinking about the world that emphasizes longitude and latitude and Cartesian distance. And so it's a really great way for thinking about distance in topographical ways, but it's very poor at thinking about distance. And that's where social network analysis and the kinds of network mapping is a way to try and start thinking about how close and how far are people relationally within a context of a genocide. I think you're dead right about spatiotemporal patterns within narrative being different from necessary spatiotemporal patterns within genocide. And that's one thing that we're really trying to work on at the moment, is to try and bring those two alongside each other. So in a sense, what happened, but also how is what happened constituted through narrative. And to be much more, I guess, open to points of disjuncture and points of conflict. And I think one of the things that I've been really interested in is the work that Eric and Simone did. Is I think they were really interested in alerting me to thinking about the way that space and time operate within narrative. And the sense that narrative, I mean, I think if any of us who've listened to survivor narratives will have noticed how time and space are not evenly distributed through survivor narrative. So a survivor telling their story of genocide never gives every place and every time equal distribution, but rather what you get is a much more kind of concertinaed moment, don't you, within a narrative. So if you think of a kind of classic 3-hour interview with a survivor of genocide, what you find there is a kind of concertinaing, don't you? That sometimes a survivor will dwell on a particular place and a particular 15 minutes for an hour within a narrative, and then deal with an entire year in 5 minutes or 2 minutes. And I think paying attention to that and starting to visualize that and map that out, I think is really critical in helping us to uncover the kinds of spatial and temporal dimensions, in particular of survivor narrative, which is a source that many of us use within genocide studies. I hope that gets some way at, if not answering your question, Henry, at least kind of pushing it in a new dimension or developing it.
Absolutely fascinating, Tim. Excellent comments. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to call on Andrew Wolford to speak his question that he put in the chat.
Thanks, Armin. I was hoping to hide off camera this early morning, but here I am. Thank you, Tim, for the
without the camera on.
My question's really asking you to connect your work on digital mapping with your recent concluding essay to the special issue on environmental histories of the Holocaust for the Journal of Genocide Research, particularly your criticism of your co-authors, or your co-contributors, I should say, who treat space as really something that gets instrumentalized and used during genocide, and you pushing them a little bit further, suggesting we need to consider the lively and even participatory aspects of space in genocide. So I'm wondering, does this work on digital mapping feed into that thinking in any way?
That's a great question, Andrew. And I think it gets at the heart of another limit, really, of the work that we've done using GIS, because I think the thing about GIS is that it's so useful for mapping location. So it can map events of genocide. And I think that can be incredibly useful and important for us as scholars, because we can start to see patterns of arrest, or patterns of murder, or patterns of hiding, patterns of participation. So there's a sense in which the location where things happened are captured. But I think one thing that it does poorly is that it doesn't grapple so much with locale the idea that space is more than location, but it's also locale, that it has a materiality. You use the word lively in a really important way there, that there's a kind of liveliness to the thingness of space, isn't there, and place, which is never captured just by longitude and latitude. And I think that's one of the criticisms, in a sense, that we as a team started to have. What's interesting, I think, to me is that Paul Jascott's an architectural historian, so he's very attuned to the materiality of built environments. And what was striking, I think, in Paul's work was he quickly moved from GIS to, as I showed, 3D viewshed analysis, because he kind of wanted to see the buildings. He wanted to see their form. And I think that's true as well in my own work, as you mentioned, Andrew, which also brings together environmental history with digital humanities, is that environmental history is attuned to locale and not just location, because it's attuned to giving to spaces a much more lively agent style dimension, a materiality, a kind of critical materiality that is just not captured in GIS mapping. And I think, Andrew, I think you get to the heart of a point here, which is at the moment that one of the things that I feel like remains disconnected a little bit in this work is that there's still a gap, I think, to be breached between the work of digital humanists and environmental historians. And I think in some ways, all of us are interested in some ways in similar questions, because I think we are interested in questions about genocide as a spatial process, and genocide in a sense where we're foregrounding space as an actor. So not just a kind of passive backdrop where genocide takes place, but actually at the heart of why genocide happens, and as a critical element in genocide taking place. What I think we have yet to do is to connect digital humanities with environmental humanities. And I think that's very much one of the things that I see. In some ways, I almost see kind of two parts of my own work. That at the moment, my environmental humanities work is incredibly non-digital. And I feel like my digital humanities work is very non-environmental. And I think one of the challenges, how do we bring that together? And it's something that I'm really thinking hard about. And I think, Andrew, your question is an astute one, because it gets to that knotty problem. I think that I feel like locale is the thing that digital humanists need to engage with much more centrally as we're thinking about space, place, and genocide.
Great. I'm going to call on Melanie. Tim, I'd like to mention you got a question from the current president of the IAGS, from a former president of the IAGS, and now you're going to get a question from the future president of the IAGS. So you've a triple header in terms of our leadership. Go ahead, Mel.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's just incredibly interesting. Really loved it. Just thinking about what you're talking about, space and location as well as context. I'm just wondering how this geospatial mapping that you're doing could be applied to Indigenous genocides. In thinking about, when you're mapping, you're thinking about cities, and Europe is a very different place geographically from places like Australia or Canada, which are very remote countries, and the location of genocidal acts are incredibly remote. How could that work? How could it be applied?
Thanks, Mel. Great question. I think, in a sense, these methods I think can work in any context. I think the critical thing is this sort of match between research question and then, most critically, the nature of the data. So the nature of the sources, and then the methods. And I think one of the things that sometimes I think has been one of the weaknesses of digital humanities and digital humanists is that we've sometimes, I think, been almost seduced by the tools, so that sometimes we kind of get excited by the array of, the kind of like the seduction of all of these amazing tools and these amazing visualizations. And we kind of like, almost like a kid in a sweet shop, a candy store, and we're like, oh, I want to use that tool. And I think sometimes we tend to start in digital humanities at the tool end, rather than actually at the research question end, and crucially at the nature of the data, at the nature of the source end. And I kind of feel like, as a team, I think we started at the tool end, and we're like, oh gosh, look at all these tools. We could apply these to genocide. This would be amazing. Like, what would we uncover? I think we gradually got more interested in the research questions. I think what we ended up with was actually a much more paying attention to the nature of the sources, which was where, in a sense, as we started to work with victim voices, then we started to think, actually, there's another way of mapping out or visualizing spatiality here within the narrative. And I think that, to me, might be one of the things that's really critical within GIS or digital humanities scholarship, is that I think there's also a kind of politics to this, which is that one thing we were really aware of is that there was a danger in our work of replicating the perpetrator archive and, in a sense, replicating the perpetrator gaze. And I think that's something you'd be attuned to more than anyone within your own context, is the danger, in a sense, of replicating the colonial archive and replicating the colonial gaze. Because one of the things that I think is crucial to think about is the kind of politics, the broader context of the politics of the creation of the tools that we're using, which is often a military context. So a tool like GIS is not created in a kind of neutral environment. You know, it's not just like some lovely, happy people decide, oh, let's create these amazing tools. Often these are tools that are created within the context of military industrial complexes. There's a politics to the tools that we use. And I think we have to really think hard about how do we decolonize the tools, as well as how do we decolonize the archive. And I think there's a sense there of some really, to me, really key political and ethical questions that digital humanists who work in Holocaust and genocide studies really need to be aware of, is that these tools are not neutral and the archives are not neutral. And how do we bring them together? So how do we ensure that we don't just replicate the colonial archive using colonial tools? And how do we create new tools that, in a sense, are much more attuned to the nature of the voices that we uncover? And I think that's, to me, has been really striking as we've worked increasingly with Jewish sources and not German sources, is that we've not adopted GIS, but we've created, if you like, bespoke tools that feel that they fit more with Jewish sources. And my sense is that that may well be true of working with indigenous sources as well, that in working with the indigenous voice, that I think there's a need, in a sense, for creating new kinds of tools. And I think this is one of the things where I feel like actually genocide studies may well be able to do something really important within digital humanities. So in a sense, rather than us in genocide studies thinking, oh, let's borrow from digital humanities in a kind of uncritical way, I feel like we actually have something to say back to digital humanities, which is to say power really matters. You know, we're kind of aware of that. The archives are places of power, and that actually digital tools are places of power. And I feel like in some ways, one of the bigger projects that I'm interested in is how do we as genocide and Holocaust studies scholars, how do we push back and how do we almost call the digital humanities to a kind of greater attention to political and ethical questions, and to fundamentally, I think, actually creating new tools that are much more fit for purpose when we're working with victim voices and with indigenous sources, and not just a colonial archive.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, really good points.
Thank you, Tim. We are actually right on schedule, and I wanted to conclude by asking you if you had any concluding thoughts, and really a sort of a quick question of is the Institute and your work moving to other genocides besides the Holocaust?
Yeah, so there's been a little bit of work that some of our team has done on Armenia. So to do some mapping work on the Armenian genocide. And I think that's one thing that we're really interested in doing, in a sense, is to often, I mean, you're more aware of this than anyone in this audience, is that I think there's a tendency sometimes for Holocaust studies to operate in this kind of silo outside of the context of genocide studies. And one of the lovely things about the invitation, Armin, to be part of this conference is to be much more engaged, because I actually think there's some really interesting work that's taking place within genocide studies. I think there's a kind of openness, an intellectual and a conceptual and a methodological openness within genocide studies that I don't necessarily find within Holocaust studies. I think one of my criticisms of Holocaust studies is that it tends to be a very inward-looking and a quite conservative field that often I think is, if not empiricist, I think sometimes positivist in its approach. And I see a sense of some fascinating work that's taking place. And one of the lovely things more recently has been reading the genocide scholarship and seeing some of the parallel work that's taking place. And I feel like there's a really rich vein of new work taking place within environmental humanities, within genocide scholarship, and also within digital and spatial humanities within genocide scholarship. And so in some ways, I feel like in Holocaust studies, we've got a lot to learn from the world of genocide scholarship. And I think that to me this is a great exchange. This is in some ways, you're the perfect community for me to have this conversation, that I feel like the questions that this community asks are questions that I'm not always asked within a Holocaust studies context.
Great. And we hope that dialogue continues in the years ahead and in Barcelona when we actually meet on the ground. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Tim, and I would like to conclude the session, and I'm sure everyone can clap their hands. Yep, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.